The black Mercedes-Benz pulled up to the construction site with a loud screech. Out stepped Emmanuel in his expensive suit, his gold watch catching the Lagos sunlight. Workers stopped what they were doing to stare at the rich man who had just arrived. But Emmanuel wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on one person, a man in dirty work clothes pushing a wheelbarrow full of cement. "Is that James?" Emmanuel whispered to himself, his face turning pale. James looked up from his wheelbarrow, sweat dripping down his face. Their eyes met across the dusty construction site. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then James smiled, the same gentle smile Emmanuel remembered from 20 years ago. "Emmanuel, my old friend," James called out, abandoning his wheelbarrow and walking toward the expensive car. But what happened next shocked everyone watching. Instead of greeting his childhood friend with joy, Emmanuel's face twisted with disgust. He stepped back toward his car, looking around to make sure no one important was watching. "Don't come near me with those dirty clothes," Emmanuel said coldly. "I don't know you." The construction site fell silent. Every worker stopped what they were doing. James froze in his tracks, his smile slowly fading. But this was just the beginning of a story that would change everything. 20 years earlier, in a small compound in Mushin, Lagos, two boys sat under a mango tree sharing their biggest dreams. Emmanuel and James had been best friends since they were 5 years old. They lived in the same compound, went to the same primary school, and did everything together. "When I grow up, I want to be a big man with plenty money," Emmanuel said, throwing a stone at a rusty can. "I want to drive big cars and live in Victoria Island." James nodded, his eyes shining with excitement. "Me too. But I also want to help people. My mama always says we should help others when we have plenty." The two boys were like brothers. Emmanuel's mother sold vegetables in the market, while James's mother washed clothes for rich people in Ikeja. Both families struggled to make ends meet, but the boys never let poverty kill their dreams. Emmanuel was the clever one in school. He always came first in class and won prizes for his essays. James was different. He was kind and always helped other students who couldn't understand their lessons. While Emmanuel dreamed of riches, James dreamed of making the world better. "One day we will both be successful," James would say, "and we will never forget where we came from." But as they grew older, something began to change between them. The scholarship that changed everything. When they were 16, their secondary school announced a scholarship competition. Only one student would win a full scholarship to study at the University of Lagos. Emmanuel and James both wanted it desperately. Emmanuel studied day and night. He borrowed books from the library and read under street lights when there was no electricity at home. James studied hard too, but he also spent time helping his sick mother and working part-time jobs to support his family. The day of the scholarship exam arrived. Both boys sat in the hot classroom, sweating as they answered difficult questions about mathematics, English, and science. Emmanuel felt confident. He had prepared for months. James struggled with some questions because he hadn't had as much time to study. 2 weeks later, the results came out. Emmanuel had won the scholarship. James was the first to congratulate him. "My friend, I'm so happy for you," he said, hugging Emmanuel tightly. "You deserve this. You will make us all proud." But instead of being grateful for his friend's support, Emmanuel felt something ugly growing in his heart. He began to think he was better than James. After all, he had won the scholarship while James had failed. Maybe this is how life works, Emmanuel thought to himself. Smart people like me succeed, while others like James will always struggle. This was the beginning of the end of their friendship. At the University of Lagos, Emmanuel discovered a new world. He met students from rich families who drove cars to school and wore expensive clothes. He began to feel ashamed of his poor background and decided to hide the truth about where he came from. When his new friends asked about his family, Emmanuel lied. "My father is a businessman," he would say. "We live in a big house in Surulere." Meanwhile, James couldn't afford to go to university. He started working as a laborer, carrying blocks and mixing cement at construction sites. The work was hard and the pay was small, but James never complained. He sent most of his money home to help his mother and younger siblings. Sometimes James would visit Emmanuel at the university. But Emmanuel began to feel embarrassed by his old friend's appearance. James would come straight from work, his clothes dusty and his hands rough from manual labor. "Why do you keep coming here?" Emmanuel asked one day, looking around nervously. "People will think we're the same type of person." James was hurt by these words, but he still cared about his childhood friend. "Emmanuel, money and education shouldn't change who you are inside," he said gently. "We grew up together. We're brothers." But Emmanuel's heart had already turned cold. "We're not brothers," he replied. "Look at yourself. You're just a laborer pushing wheelbarrows. Look at me, I'm going to be a big man. We're not the same." James left that day with tears in his eyes. He never visited Emmanuel again. Years passed. Emmanuel graduated with honors and got a good job at a bank in Lagos Island. He worked hard and climbed the ladder of success. He bought expensive clothes, rented a nice flat, and started driving a car. On the outside he looked successful. But success made Emmanuel even more proud and cruel. One day he was driving through a construction site in Ikoyi when he saw a familiar figure pushing a wheelbarrow full of sand. It was James. Emmanuel parked his car and called out, "James? James?" James looked up, surprised and happy to see his old friend. He abandoned his wheelbarrow and ran toward Emmanuel, his face lighting up with joy. "Emmanuel, my friend, look how well you're doing," James said, admiring Emmanuel's car and clothes. "I'm so proud of you." But instead of being happy to see James, Emmanuel felt disgusted. Here was his childhood friend still doing manual labor after all these years. Emmanuel felt embarrassed that someone might see them together. "Look at you," Emmanuel said with a cruel laugh. "Still pushing wheelbarrows like a common laborer. What a waste of life. While I'm driving cars and making money, you're still in the dust carrying sand. How pathetic." James's smile disappeared. Other workers on the construction site stopped to listen. Emmanuel continued his cruel words, not caring about his friend's feelings. "This is what happens to people who don't use their brains," Emmanuel continued loudly. "You chose to remain a nobody pushing wheelbarrows while smart people like me become successful. Don't ever approach me again. I don't associate with failures." James stood there, humiliated in front of all his co-workers. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't say a word. He just turned around and went back to his wheelbarrow. Emmanuel drove away, laughing and feeling superior. He thought he had won. He thought he was better than James. He had no idea that this moment would come back to haunt him in the most shocking way possible. But what Emmanuel didn't know was that James had a secret, something that would turn everything upside down and leave everyone speechless. The real story was just beginning, and the truth about who James really was would shock the entire city of Lagos. What was James hiding? How would their paths cross again? And what would happen when the truth finally came to light? The answer would change everything Emmanuel thought he knew about success, friendship, and the true meaning of being a big man. Back at the construction site, after Emmanuel's cruel words, James quietly returned to his wheelbarrow. The other workers looked at him with pity, but James just smiled sadly and continued working. What they didn't know was that James had a phone call to make. That evening, James sat in his small room and dialed a number. "Hello, Mr. Johnson," he said in perfect English. "This is James Adebayo. I think it's time." On the other end of the line, a surprised voice replied, "Are you sure, James? You've been hiding for so long. Why now?" "Because I've learned everything I needed to learn," James said quietly. "And someone I once cared about needs to understand what real success looks like." What Emmanuel didn't know was that James Adebayo wasn't just any construction worker. He was the secret son of Chief Adebayo, one of the richest men in Nigeria. But this wasn't the most shocking part of the story. Chief Adebayo had made a deal with his son 20 years ago. "If you want to inherit my business empire," he had told young James, "you must first understand the struggles of common people. You must work with your hands, live among the poor, and learn what real hard work means. Only then will you be ready to lead." James had agreed to this test. While Emmanuel was climbing the ladder of success through education, James was learning a different kind of lesson. He worked as a laborer not because he had to, but because he chose to. Every day he sent money home, not to help his poor mother, but to charity organizations that helped families like the one he pretended to come from. For 15 years, James had lived this double life. He owned construction companies across Lagos, but he worked in them as a common laborer. He had millions in the bank, but he lived in a simple room and ate simple food. He drove expensive cars at night, but pushed wheelbarrows during the day. All this time, James had been watching Emmanuel from a distance. He saw how success had changed his childhood friend. He saw how Emmanuel became proud and cruel. And he decided to teach him a lesson that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, something strange happened at Emmanuel's bank. His manager called him into the office with a worried expression. "Emmanuel, we have a problem," the manager said, sweating nervously. "Our biggest client wants to meet with you personally. He's threatening to withdraw all his money if we don't handle his account properly." Emmanuel straightened his tie proudly. "Don't worry, sir. I can handle any big client." "How much money are we talking about?" 2 billion naira, the manager whispered. Emmanuel's eyes widened. 2 billion naira. This was the biggest account he had ever handled. "Who is this client?" he asked. "His name is James Adebayo. He owns Adebayo Construction Group. He's one of the richest men in Lagos, and he's coming here this afternoon." Emmanuel's heart began to race, but not from excitement. The name James made him think of his childhood friend, but surely this couldn't be the same person. That James was just a poor laborer pushing wheelbarrows. At exactly 3 p.m., the bank's VIP entrance opened. Emmanuel and his manager rushed to welcome their important client. But when the door opened, Emmanuel's world turned upside down. Walking in was James, the same James he had mocked at the construction site. But this James looked completely different. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that cost more than Emmanuel's monthly salary. His shoes were Italian leather, and he carried himself like the billionaire he truly was. Behind him walked 3 bodyguards and a personal assistant carrying a briefcase. Emmanuel's mouth fell open. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He just stared as his childhood friend, the man he had called a failure, walked into the bank like he owned it. "Good afternoon," James said calmly to the bank manager. "I'm James Adebayo. I believe you wanted to see me about my account." The manager immediately began bowing and apologizing. "Mr. Adebayo, sir. We are so honored to have you here. This is Emmanuel, our best account officer. He will personally handle all your needs." James looked at Emmanuel with the same gentle smile he had worn as a child. "Hello, Emmanuel," he said quietly. "It's good to see you again." Emmanuel's legs felt weak. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Around them, other bank workers whispered in amazement. The man they thought was just a poor laborer was actually one of the richest men in Nigeria. James requested a private meeting with Emmanuel. They sat in the bank's VIP room, alone except for the sound of Lagos traffic outside. "I know you have questions," James began. "So let me explain everything." Emmanuel listened in shock as James told him the whole truth. About his father's test. About the construction companies he secretly owned. About the 15 years he had spent learning what real work meant. "But why?" Emmanuel finally managed to ask. "Why did you let me mock you? Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" James looked sad. "Because I wanted to see who you had become, my friend. I watched you change from a kind boy into a man who looks down on others. I had to know if there was still hope for the Emmanuel I once knew." Emmanuel felt tears coming to his eyes. "James, I'm so sorry. I was terrible to you. I was so proud and stupid. Money and education are good things, James continued, but they mean nothing if they make you cruel. I have billions of naira, Emmanuel, but I never forgot that we are all the same inside. Rich or poor, we all deserve respect. James stood up and walked to the window. I'm going to give you a choice, Emmanuel. I'm looking for someone to run my new company, Adebayo Banking Group. It will be the biggest financial company in West Africa. The job pays 50 million naira per year. Emmanuel couldn't believe what he was hearing. 50 million naira. That was more money than he had ever dreamed of. But, James continued, there's a condition. You must first work for 1 year as a laborer in my construction company. You must push wheelbarrows, carry blocks, and do the same work you mocked me for doing. You must learn what real hard work feels like. You must understand that every job has dignity. Emmanuel thought about this offer. His pride told him to refuse. How could a university graduate like him do manual labor? What would people think? But then he remembered James's kindness. Even after all the cruel things Emmanuel had said, James was still offering him a chance at incredible success. If you accept, James said, you will learn what I learned. That true success isn't about how much money you have or what car you drive. True success is about how you treat other people, especially those who have less than you. Emmanuel looked at his childhood friend, the man he had called a failure, who was now offering him the opportunity of a lifetime. I accept, Emmanuel said, tears streaming down his face. I want to learn. I want to become the man you still believe I can be. 1 year later, at a big ceremony in Lagos, James Adebayo announced the opening of Adebayo Banking Group. The new CEO was Emmanuel, who had just completed his year of manual labor. But the most shocking moment came when Emmanuel gave his speech. In front of hundreds of Lagos's most important people, he told the whole story. He talked about his cruelty, his pride, and how his childhood friend had taught him the greatest lesson of his life. I once mocked a man for pushing a wheelbarrow, Emmanuel said to the amazed crowd. I thought I was better than him because I wore a suit and he wore work clothes. But that man was not only richer than me, he was also wiser, kinder, and more successful in every way that truly matters. Emmanuel pointed to James, who was sitting in the front row. My friend James taught me that real success is not about looking down on others, but about lifting them up. It's not about forgetting where you came from, but about using your blessings to help others reach where you are. The crowd erupted in applause. Newspapers across Nigeria carried the story. Social media buzzed with the incredible tale of the billionaire who disguised himself as a laborer and the proud man who learned humility. From that day forward, Emmanuel and James worked together to build not just successful companies, but also schools and hospitals for poor communities across Nigeria. They never forgot the lesson that changed everything. That true greatness comes not from what you achieve, but from how you treat others along the way. And whenever someone asked James why he had spent 15 years pushing wheelbarrows when he could have been living in luxury, he would smile and say, because that's where I learned the difference between being rich and being truly successful. The man who was once mocked for pushing a wheelbarrow had taught the entire nation what real success looks like. And everyone who heard the story was left completely speechless.